suspect in the slightest how much I would come to love Yuri on Ice, just like I'm sure plenty of people weren't expecting the massive heights of popularity it managed to reach over the course of its first season. And while a lot of it is just personal taste, just as much credit should go to how strong of a show it is, and I genuinely believe it to be a well-crafted work worthy of analysis. To be blunt, this general type of show isn't really my usual fare, just like video essays are definitely not my usual art form, but the way it managed to worm its way into my brain and never leave, compounded with going all night without sleep because of it, has really forced my hand here. I like talking about animation, and I like going into depth about why I like the things I like, but I'd also rather stab myself in the leg than get involved in something like Tumblr discourse about this, so clearly my only option was staying up to bang out my thoughts and start rambling my passions into the YouTube void. Now, while the animation is frequently, if extremely inconsistently gorgeous, and the overall aesthetic presentation is extremely pleasant and appealing, that's actually not the strongest element of the show to me. That honor, without a doubt, belongs to how well done I feel the characterization in the show is. There's a reason that my love for this show peaked well after the quality of its animation did. True to the more lighthearted tone of the show, the entire cast is not only extremely likable, with a very small amount of exceptions depending on taste, but tended to be very memorable despite the huge amount of characters they had to cram into a small amount of episodes. The single competition characters are quirky enough to stand out for the 1 or 2 episodes they appear in without ever feeling too gimmicky, and a lot of them have a surprising amount of depth to them. The reoccurring supporting cast is just as noteworthy for their very distinct personalities, and the show does a good job of selling them as being actual people off the ice as well. Bachit Chulana is a super likable Thai skater with a penchant for cute things and social media and a deep sense of pride in his culture, and also serves to flesh out Yuri's character better through their friendship. The Canadian Jean-Jacques Leroy, while the only character meant to come off as a total jerk, also has a layer of decent depth to him, and his inflated self-image is shown to be more complicated than it first appears. And Christophe Giacometti is, well, the way he is, but he also plays a very important role in humanizing Victor as his closest friend, as well as being a foil to Yuri because of his admiration for him. I'm mostly just getting this point out of the way, since I think it's an important one and not just a footnote, since the characters populating a series are linked to the overall tone of a work, and 1 or 2 strong characters are rarely enough to make a series stand out if there's nothing to back them up. That being said, the backbone of the show is easily its 3 leads, and the dynamics between them. I'm really going to focus on Yuri and Victor here, although Yurio is another incredibly strong character in his own right, and I love him a lot. Yuri Kotsky might honestly be one of the most relatable anime protagonists I've seen in a while, and though this is obviously a more personal thing, not inherently indicative of his strength as a character, it does go a long way. The clear issues of anxiety and depression underlying a lot of his actions and thought processes struck a very strong chord to me as someone with vaguely similar experiences, even if I can't ice skate for shit. Of note, I think, is how while these issues are rarely at the forefront of his character, they remain a very clear thread between his actions, especially his otherwise more inexplicable ones, and tying into his relationship with Victor throughout the show. He's very likable, even with his flaws, and even before I had fully warmed up to the show, I wanted to root for him from the very beginning. His struggles aren't particularly grand in the overall scale of anime, which makes him all the more accessible as a viewer. He's a person I can imagine knowing and can see myself in equal measure. Viktor Nikiforov, on the other hand, is presented entirely differently, and in a way that plays off of Yuri's characterization very interestingly. He's shown right off the bat to be a living legend, a 5-time world champion, completely unattainable in addition to being clearly regarded as gorgeous by everyone in the show. In the entire first episode, he only has 2 real lines, neither of which really give a lot of insight into the kind of person he is. The introductory episodes are littered with other people giving their opinions and interpretations of him, but with the exception of Yakov, none of these people really know him as much as the idea of him. For the vast majority of the series, the audience probably understands Victor as a person about as much as Yuri does, and it's at this point that it needs to be addressed that Yuri is an extremely unreliable narrator. Not intentionally, but on account of his personality, especially his insecurities. It's not until episode 10, at which point their relationship has already evolved pretty damn far, that the narrative shifts to give him control, giving the audience a hell of a lot more clarity than before. There's a bit at that point that I consider an absolute stroke of genius in terms of visual storytelling, where a single shot effectively solidifies the meaning behind nearly all of his seemingly mysterious actions in the beginning of the series. And it was at that point when everyone also started to realize the subtle but very significant lens Yuri had been putting on his own story from the start. A key component of the way Yuri and Victor's relationship evolves is them coming to understand each other as people. Their successes in that regard make for their most touching emotional exchanges, just as their failings likewise are the primary source of tension between them. Yuri's difficulties with his own self-worth, for instance, also take the form of him having a hard time imagining anyone else holding him in high regard, something that inevitably causes a rift between him and Victor when he fails to address it clearly. And the complete isolation Victor experienced by being an unparalleled genius in his field left him absolutely terrible at connecting to and empathizing with other people. And it's about at this point that I really have to address one of, if not the most noteworthy things about this show, and that's that, yeah, that relationship is a romantic one. All the analysis videos I've seen thus far in the show generally fall into the schools of either focusing entirely on that aspect or barely acknowledging it as a topic of importance. I don't really want to fall into the former, especially because those tend to be very noticeably through the lens of Western fandom, which often leaves a bad taste in my mouth, but the latter is ignoring an incredible strong point of the show. Yuri on Ice is about Yuri and Victor's relationship pretty much just as much as it's about the sport of ice skating, hence why I described it as a primarily character-driven show, and that main relationship, like it or not, is romantic. I myself am gay, and I think that's worth mentioning because no one on Earth is unbiased, and obviously this is going to have an impact on how I consume media with non-straight characters and relationships. The topic of representation in media is incredibly multi-layered and nuanced, and I don't think oversimplification does it any good, nor do I really want to get too into it. In regards to this work, I can understand criticism levied at the content of this representation, although I'm really not interested in the debate of whether this is representation at all. I don't want to spend too much time on my personal hang-ups about it, but the fact of the matter is, even with an air of ambiguity to the romance in this show, that anyone is free to criticize as they see fit, the fact that they are a couple should really only be ambiguous to someone in really serious denial. Believe me, I get the desire for extremely cut and dry gay romance and characters, and frankly, I wouldn't complain if the creators and studio had the guts to go a little farther. But the fact is, this is a show that goes for subtlety and nuance in a lot of ways, and the way their relationship progresses doesn't clash with the tone of the show. Would I like a more obvious kiss scene? Of course I would, but that still doesn't negate the fact that regardless of presentation, they have kissed on screen. Like, it happened. It wouldn't make any fucking sense to be anything else from the way it was shot alone. But this is something I could obviously rag on forever, so I'm going to talk about the parts of the romantic subplot that really made it work for me. The fact that anime viewers at large, including myself, have become so wildly desensitized to yaoi bait with no intention to deliver, without a doubt colored our view of pretty much everything leading up to the kiss that signaled to viewers that, yes, they were really doing this. But on the rewatch, there are a lot of scenes that read pretty much exactly the same way most quality anime romance does, just with the caveat of them being both dudes. Ironically enough, people like myself who were scared of being let down fell into the same trap as people blinded by heteronormative ideas of romance. That being that scenes that were very blatantly indicative of flirtation only didn't seem that way because Victor wasn't a woman. I don't think it's a coincidence that the show pulled an entertaining bait and switch with Yuri's implied crush on Yuko in the very first episode that didn't go anywhere, because reality happened and sometimes boys and girls are just friends. Hell, the same blushy face Yuri pulls then is pretty much the exact same as he does around Victor in plenty of scenes, but preconceived notions nearly everyone had about the nature of the show were a hard thing to escape. In any case, it's shown time and time again that Yuri has a hard time really reaching out to people and expressing his feelings, despite being surrounded by people who care about him. Something I noticed while watching the first episode, after God knows how many times, was the way Yuri was presented in conjunction with the people around him. He keeps his distance when he can, and only when more proactive characters make a point of entering his personal space does he end up in close contact with them, often suggesting these characters' eagerness to support him, while ones who are less proactive remain at a distance, with Yuri unmotivated to close that gap. This visual reflection of interpersonal dynamics is especially evident in his scenes with Yuko. Outside of flashbacks of their shared history, the thing tying them together, there's always a literal wall between them, which feels like an intentional choice. Even when the show is setting it up like he's about to confess, he stands at a distance, not even getting as close as he did during his earlier routine, which is where Victor comes in. Much more so than their first one-off interaction after Yuri's failure at the Grand Prix final, their beautifully animated in-sync skating routines paint a picture of their characters in comparison to each other. Their circumstances are different, but they both found themselves emotionally isolated among the people they know. Series creator Mitsuru Kubo has said that the coach-student bond being the focus, rather than one of rivals, was a way of countering the by definition solitary nature of solo figure skating in order to tell the kind of story they wanted to tell. But they also use this to their storytelling advantage when they can. The show utilizes this unavoidable plot detail to really work the stories and feelings of routines into larger individualized character arcs. And despite this scene happening before that's been thoroughly established as a consistent trait of the series, it's not hard to make the leap that there's meaning to be found in their skating. From this moment on, Victor's presence in Yuri's world is the most extreme case of another character pushing up against and through the walls Yuri had carefully constructed around himself. Even as Yuri and his determination are what drive the plot, Victor effectively instigates it with his seemingly inexplicable desire to coach him. And, fittingly to theme, Victor makes a point of getting right up into Yuri's personal space constantly, a detail that almost makes him seem comedically desperate on a rewatch, but also reflects his own problems making genuine connections to people. He's someone whose image is based in his charm and confidence, despite Yuri being the first person he seems to actively want to pursue a real relationship with, thus giving him no experience in how to go about it, so his behavior makes perfect sense with his character arc. The first physical contact Yuri initiates is when he hugs him in episode 3, after realizing what he really wants is for Victor to stay with him, which marks a decided shift in their dynamic. Even though he hadn't actually skated yet in the competition against Yuri for his attention, this personal connection is the reason he wins, furthering the interconnection of individual character development, the development of their relationship, and the forward progression of the story. Immediately following that, in episode 4, is another important shift in their dynamic, where the two have their first real emotional conversation, where most notably, Yuri says that Victor meets him where he is, and that is the reason their relationship works, something reflected in the cautiously distant body language the two take during the scene before taking the other's hand. I could go on about how episode 5 has yet another landmark with Yuri's declaration of love on TV, and then episode 6, where Yuri gains confidence by owning the knowledge that Victor is his more than anyone else, and by then it's episode 7, with possibly the most iconic scene in the show thus far, but I think I've made my point. With a few exceptions for drama's sake, the show is determined to constantly build upon the relationship between its leads while also building up their individual characters along the way, and it does this by seemingly one-upping itself every single episode in this regard. It's paced well enough that nothing feels like an illogical leap to make, but comparing their relationship in episodes 2 to 5 or 6 to 9, it's obvious that their growth is a constant thing that never takes a backseat to the action. Particularly with the aid of the required time skips needed to fit everything in, their relationship feels very natural, even when some of the premise reminds me of a more fairy tale-like romance. Whatever your stance in the presentation, the writers clearly committed to this concept, because the same romantic subplot, but half-assed, could have easily contributed nothing into what is ultimately still a sports anime about putting knives in your feet and dancing on ice. I consider Yuri on Ice to be a legitimately beautiful work for plenty of reasons, and maybe someday I'll talk about the visuals, considering that's the closest thing to my actual area of expertise. But why it stood out to me and became one of my honest-to-God favorite anime is the love with which it treated its characters, and sappily enough, the love with which the characters treated each other, which is rare. Maybe you can chalk it up to me being a cynical gay, but a lot of romance and other genres of shows really don't do much for me, and certainly not as much as this one did. Either way, I went from careful, lukewarm apathy to completely loving this show over the course of its run because of the heart at the center of it, and I think that's something to be celebrated about it. And I do feel bad that I didn't talk about Yurio, because again, he's a phenomenal character and I adore him, but this sleep-deprived stream of consciousness is running out of steam. If you made it this far, thank you for taking the time to humor me on something that means a lot to me, and I can only pray that the probable second season keeps this up enough that I may someday be motivated to round this out better someday.